the stories. What happened inside this mountain lodge will shock you. The guest log from that mountain lodge still sits in a plastic evidence sleeve with one page glued to another. Dispatch records show a routine welfare check, then a second call minutes later that changed everything. In early October of 2011, Tegan Rourke was 33 and worked as a county building inspector. That morning, Tegan planned to recheck a roof repair on a remote lodge above a winding forest road. The lodge stayed open year-round, but the owner only kept staff there on busy weekends. Tegan had done permits there before, and the place always felt quiet but harmless. The weather was clear, and the drive up took just under 2 hours from the county offices downtown. Tegan's county truck climbed through pine stands and bare rock, and the radio kept fading in and out. A printed work order sat on the passenger seat, with a note about leaks over the dining hall. Tegan expected a quick walkthrough, a few photos, and a signature from whoever was on site. At the turnoff, the lodge sign leaned slightly, and the gravel lot had only one vehicle parked. It was an older SUV with an out-of-state plate, and its driver window was cracked open. Tegan noted it in a small notebook because parked vehicles mattered in a rural inspection log. The lodge itself was a long timber building with a stone chimney and tall windows facing the slope. Tegan knocked at the front doors and waited, then tried again with a little more force. No one answered, and the doors were locked, which was unusual during posted open hours. Tegan walked around to the side entrance near the kitchen, where staff usually came and went. That door was also locked, but the deadbolt was not fully seated, like it had been rushed. Tegan called the owner's number from the permit file, and it went to voicemail after 4 rings. A text message sent, then stayed unread, and Tegan felt the first small pinch of worry. County rules allowed an exterior inspection without entry, but the leak note required a look inside. Tegan radioed the office, reported no contact, and said a second attempt would be made shortly. Tegan moved under the eaves and checked the roof line from the ground with binoculars. The shingles looked new over one section, and a gutter joint had been patched with sloppy sealant. A faint drip line stained the siding, and Tegan snapped photos with a work phone. Then a sound came from inside, a single thud that carried through the front windows. Tegan froze, listening, and heard nothing else for several seconds after that heavy impact. The lodge sat too far from neighbors for casual foot traffic, and no wind moved the doors. Tegan tried the front doors again, and this time the right door shifted a half-inch. It had been locked before, but now the latch gave slightly, like something inside pressed against it. Tegan stepped back and decided not to force entry, because welfare checks were not the county job. Still, the odd shift in the door made leaving feel wrong, like ignoring a smoke smell. Tegan called the sheriff dispatch line and requested a deputy to check the building. The call log later showed Tegan used calm language, but the dispatcher noted concern about possible injury. While waiting, Tegan walked back toward the SUV to see if someone was nearby in the lot. The SUV keys were not visible, and the seats were empty, but a paper map lay open on the dash. A small badge clip hung from the rearview mirror, the kind used for conferences or guided tours. Tegan could not read the name through the glass, but the plastic sleeve looked freshly printed. Tegan stood by the county truck and watched the lodge windows, expecting movement in the curtains. Nothing shifted, and the silence started to feel staged, like a room waiting for a cue. A second thud came, softer this time, followed by a faint scrape that lasted 2 seconds. Tegan raised the phone to record audio, then stopped, unsure if that would help later. Deputy Marlo Kincaid arrived about 20 minutes later, alone in a marked unit. Marlo was 41 and had worked patrol in the county for 14 years. He greeted Tegan, took in the locked lodge and the lone SUV, and asked what happened so far. Tegan explained the door shift and the sounds, then handed over the permit file contact number. Marlo tried the front entrance, found the same slight give, and tested the handle carefully. The door opened 2 inches, then stuck, as if something heavy pressed it from the other side. Marlo called out, "Sheriff's office! Anyone inside?" and waited for an answer that never came. He motioned Tegan to stay back, then reached around the gap with a flashlight. The beam caught a strip of carpet near the threshold, darkened by something that looked wet. Marlo's posture changed, and he pushed the door harder, but it still would not swing fully. He stepped aside, drew a small pry bar from his kit, and worked the latch without splintering wood. The door gave another few inches, and the smell hit them both, sharp and sour like old water and metal. Marlowe backed out and called dispatch again, requesting a second unit and medical standby. The dispatch log reportedly shows his tone shifted from routine to urgent within that sentence. He then circled to the kitchen door, found it partially unseated, and eased it open with his shoulder. That entrance opened cleanly, and the two of them stepped into a dim hallway lined with framed photos. The lodge was colder inside than it should have been, like the heat had been off for hours. A small radio played faintly in the kitchen, but the volume was low, almost like it was meant to hide. Marlowe followed the sound toward the dining hall, moving slow and keeping Tegan behind him. The floorboards creaked, and a hanging light swayed slightly, though no air seemed to move. At the dining hall doorway, something blocked the opening from the far side. It was a chair tipped on its side, wedged against the door like a crude barricade. Marlowe pushed it away with his boot, and the doorway cleared enough to see the room. The tables were set for breakfast, but no food sat out, and the place looked paused mid-routine. Near the fireplace, a man lay on his back with one arm bent under him at an awkward angle. He wore a lodge, staff polo, and his face had bruising around one eye, older than a few minutes. Marlowe checked for response from a safe distance, then moved in and felt for a pulse. The man was cold, and Marlowe looked down at the floor beside him, where dried streaks ran toward the entry. Tegan stood in the doorway, trying not to stare, and focused on small details to stay steady. A lodge keyring lay near the man's hand, and one key was snapped clean in half. A thin line of clear fishing wire ran from the chair at the doorway to a table leg. It was tied tight, and Tegan saw it only because the flashlight glare caught its sheen. Marlowe followed the wire with his eyes, then cut it with a pocket knife to remove tension. He told Tegan to step back into the hallway, and Tegan did without arguing. He radioed dispatch again, and his short words suggested a deceased person and a possible scene. The radio response crackled, and for a moment, Tegan could not understand any of it through the static. While waiting for backup, Marlowe did a slow sweep without touching anything else. He checked the front entrance from inside and found the reason it would not open. A heavy rolling cart from the kitchen had been shoved against it, with towels stuffed under its wheels. The cart was positioned with care, like someone wanted the door to move just enough to tempt entry. The lodge office sat behind the front desk, and Marlowe could see light under its door. He tested the knob, found it locked, then noticed a second strand of wire at ankle height. That wire ran from the office door handle to a wall hook, like a tension trap. He stepped over it and stayed clear, then called out again to announce his presence. No one answered from the office, but a printer clicked once, then hummed as if waking. The sound was small, yet it made Tegan's stomach tighten, because it implied someone had been there. Marlowe kept his weapon holstered and used a mirror tool to look around the door edge. He saw no movement, then waited, like he was giving a hidden person time to make a choice. Backup arrived, along with a medic unit that stopped short when the scene was explained. Deputy Arden Sola joined Marlowe, and together they secured the lodge and kept Tegan outside. Tegan sat on a stone bench by the entrance, hands on knees, watching steam rise from their breath. From that spot, Tegan noticed something odd about the SUV. The rear hatch was not fully latched. When Arden checked the SUV, she did not open it right away, but photographed the gap first. Inside the hatch, a duffel bag sat open with folders, a portable recorder, and extra badge clips. The badges all carried the lodge name, with a line that read, Guest Services Volunteer Weekend. None of the badges had a photo, only a blank square and a printed first name that looked generic. Arden set the bag aside as possible evidence and closed the hatch gently, leaving it for investigators. Detectives arrived later that afternoon, and the lodge became a sealed scene with tape and logs. Tegan gave a formal statement, repeating details, and was asked twice about the fishing wire. Tegan described where it was tied and how it caught the flashlight glare, and the detective wrote carefully. They also asked about the earlier thuds, and Tegan admitted the second scrape sounded like furniture moving. The detectives found another staff member in an upstairs room, alive but disoriented and dehydrated. She was named Lorna Vess, 36, and worked as a front desk clerk during weekends. Lorna reportedly said she had been locked in the room and her phone had been taken. She remembered arguing with someone she thought was a guest, then a sting in her neck, then darkness. In the office, investigators found a laptop open to a guest reservation list. Several names were typed in, then deleted, then typed again, like someone kept changing the plan. A printed sheet sat in the printer tray, warm to the touch, listing check-in times for people who never arrived. The times were spaced exactly 15 minutes apart, and each entry used the same handwriting style in the notes field. They also recovered an audio recorder under the front desk, still running when it was found. The file timestamp matched the morning of the welfare check, according to later reports. It captured faint footsteps, the scrape of a cart, and a voice whispering a phrase twice. The phrase was hard to make out, but analysts later suggested it sounded like, "Keep them outside." Tegan was asked to review photos of the dining hall layout from earlier permit visits. Tegan noticed the tables were arranged differently than normal, leaving clear paths between doorways. The fireplace tools had been moved to the far wall, neatly lined up like they were counted. A single chair sat facing the front desk, centered, as if someone wanted a person to sit there. It was the kind of staging that looked normal until someone pointed out how deliberate it was. The dead man was identified as a seasonal employee hired 3 weeks earlier. His employment file listed only a local mailing address and a prepaid phone number. Investigators could not confirm prior work references, and the ID copy looked unusually clean. The medical examiner later ruled the death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma and delayed help. The report noted older bruises, suggesting the man had been struck earlier, then moved. Lorna, once stabilized, gave more details in a second interview that detectives treated as key. She recalled a guest who arrived the night before, claiming the lodge needed a safety inspection. He wore a lanyard badge that looked official, and he spoke with confident, practiced calm. He asked where the security cameras recorded and whether the front doors could be opened from inside. When Lorna questioned the request, he smiled and said, "It's a drill. The owner knows." That line sounded harmless in the moment, but it became important once detectives checked the owner's story. The owner insisted no drill was planned and no outside safety contractor had been hired. Phone records showed the owner received missed calls, but none were returned until late afternoon. He also admitted he rarely checked the lodge on weekdays, and he trusted staff to handle small issues. That gap in oversight gave someone space to run a plan without interruption. The biggest break came from the guest services volunteer badges found in the SUV. A detective called the lodge booking vendor and asked about the volunteer weekend program. The vendor said no such event existed, and the lodge had never used that wording in promotions. The badge design, however, matched a template used by a nearby conference center. It was a generic print layout, the kind anyone could buy online and customize in minutes. Investigators then pulled archived security footage from a gas station down the mountain. The footage reportedly showed the older SUV arriving the previous evening, then leaving briefly, then returning. A man in a ball cap carried a rolling cart cover, like the ones used for banquet linens. He moved with familiarity, like he knew exactly what tools he needed and where to place them. He also wore a lanyard, and the badge swung forward once, showing a blank square where a photo belonged. The twist did not come from a hidden identity reveal, but from a detail Tegan almost dismissed. During the first statement, Tegan mentioned the front door shifting, as if something pressed it. A detective later asked Tegan to walk through that moment again, step by step, without guessing. Tegan realized the door shift happened after the first thud, not before, which meant timing mattered. It suggested someone moved the cart to create the tempting gap only after hearing Tegan outside. That led detectives back to the audio recorder under the front desk. They enhanced the section between the thud and the door shift, filtering out the radio static. A clearer sound emerged, the rolling squeak of rubber wheels, followed by a breathy whisper. The phrase was not "keep them outside" after all, it was "get them outside," repeated with urgency. It sounded like a command to someone else, not a reminder to self. From there, the theory shifted in a way that surprised even the investigators on the case. They had assumed a lone intruder staged traps to prevent entry, then escaped out a back route. Instead, the evidence pointed to two people, one inside controlling access, another upstairs managing Lorna. The dead employee likely resisted, got injured, and became a problem to move out of sight. The person at the front desk then tried to lure an outsider in, but keep them from seeing too much. The chair, barricade, and fishing wire were not meant to harm an intruder. They were meant to slow them down, trip them lightly, and force them to look at the floor. If someone stumbled, they would focus on their footing, not on the office door or the front desk area. The rolling cart at the front door was positioned to let the latch click, making it seem unlocked. That tiny invitation would draw a person to the wrong entrance, while the real exit stayed clear elsewhere. A second exit did exist, but it was not a secret tunnel or anything dramatic. It was the service stairwell that led to a ground-level storage door behind the lodge. That door had no alarm contact, because it was listed as an interior-only access in old plans. Tegan's permit photos from years earlier showed the door, but no one had updated the security list. The person who planned this had likely studied those plans or worked a similar building before. In the weeks that followed, the case did not end with a neat arrest and a televised confession. Investigators identified a suspect connected to a string of small frauds involving fake inspections. Witness statements placed him near the lodge, and a partial fingerprint matched on a badge clip. Still, the second person remained unknown, and no clear motive beyond control and deception was proven. Official statements used careful language, noting the investigation remained open and evidence was incomplete. Tegan returned to the county office and filed the inspection as incomplete, with notes that felt unreal. For months after, Tegan kept replaying the moment the door shifted, like the building itself breathed. It was not a ghost story, and no one claimed anything supernatural happened in that lodge. It was just a plan, built from small choices, simple tools, and a confidence that nobody would look closely. Tegan learned that the scariest part was how ordinary everything looked until the pattern appeared. The stories. Never ignore calls from a ranger station. The warning was printed on the county dispatch poster after the incident at the North Ridge Ranger Station. It was not a slogan, it was a reminder, written like a bruise. In late September of 2019, Tamsin Crow was 34 and worked as a county radio technician. She drove service routes between towers, repeaters, and the kind of buildings people forgot existed. That morning, she had one simple goal: swap a failing battery bank before the weekend storm arrived. The request looked routine: a maintenance ticket with a ranger station phone number attached. The station sat near a long stretch of forest road in a western state that gets windy in fall. It was not remote like a postcard, but it was far enough that help came slowly. Tamsin packed tools, a spare handset, and a digital recorder she used for interference complaints. She also brought a printed map, because cell service vanished on the last ridge. About 20 minutes from the station, her work phone rang with a number she did not recognize. The caller ID still labeled it as the Ranger Station, which made her lift it quickly. A man spoke in a flat tone, and his words sounded like they were being read. "Do not come here alone. Do not call the sheriff. Bring the radio keys." Tamsin asked who he was, and the line went silent except for a soft clicking sound. It was not wind. It was rhythmic, like a relay switching on and off somewhere nearby. She said she could call the ranger on duty, and the man whispered one more sentence. "Tell dispatch the blue folder is not theirs." Then hang up. The call ended, and her phone showed full bars for a moment before dropping to none. Tamsin pulled over, took a breath, and wrote down the exact wording in her notebook. She tried to call back, but the phone acted like the number did not exist. That was the first time she considered turning around, and she did not yet. She reached the ranger station a little after 10, and the parking lot was empty. The building looked normal, a low office with a covered porch and a faded mapboard. A sign on the door said, "Closed for training." But the chain was not latched. Tamsin knocked anyway, then waited long enough to hear her own tires ticking. When nobody answered, she walked around to the side where the utility cabinet sat. The cabinet held a backup radio console and a line to the nearest repeater tower. The padlock had been cut cleanly, and the broken shackle lay in the gravel. Tamsin did not touch it, and she backed away as if it might still be hot. She returned to her truck and called county dispatch on the two-way, not the phone. Dispatch answered quickly, and Tamsin kept her voice steady while giving her unit number. She said she had arrived for maintenance, and she had received a strange warning call. She repeated the line about the blue folder, and the dispatcher paused before replying. The dispatcher asked her to say it again, and Tamsin did. Slower this time. A second voice came on. reportedly a supervisor who handled after-hours ranger contacts. He asked if the caller mentioned radio keys, and she confirmed that detail quietly. Then he told her to stay in her vehicle and not to enter the building. Tamsin watched the front door, and she saw a dim shape pass behind the glass. It was not a clear silhouette, more like a shadow crossing a hallway light. She keyed the mic and told dispatch what she saw, and her hands shook once. Dispatch said units were en route, and the supervisor told her to keep recording. Tamsin turned on her digital recorder and set it on the dashboard near the speaker. She kept the truck idling, and she angled the mirror to watch the porch. A minute later, the station phone rang again, and this time the sound carried outside. It rang from inside the building, muffled and lonely, then stopped, then rang again. Tamsin did not answer her work phone when it lit up, even though instinct begged her. Instead, she recorded the ringtone pattern because it sounded slightly warped, like tape drag. Dispatch asked if she could read the number on the caller ID, and she tried. It displayed the ranger station number again, as if the station were calling itself. A deputy arrived first, then a second unit, and they parked behind her truck. They kept their lights off, and they approached on foot with hands near their belts. Tamsin stepped out only when told, and she handed her recorder to the deputy sergeant. She explained the cut lock, the shadow, and the message about the blue folder. The deputies checked the front door and called out, but nobody answered from inside. They entered with caution, and Tamsin stayed outside near the trucks with dispatch on radio. Through the open door, she could hear boots on tile and a distant phone ringing again. A deputy called for a ranger by name, then asked for a key holder, then swore softly. The sergeant came back out and told Tamsin to wait, but his face had changed. He said the building looked staged, and he did not mean messy or ransacked. He meant chairs were placed wrong, files were open on a desk, and radios were unplugged. He also said the station logbook had been removed, along with a blue folder. The mention of the blue folder made Tamsin feel cold, even in the sun. She asked what the folder was, and the sergeant did not answer right away. He said it might be nothing, then added that it was nothing he wanted to guess. Then he asked if she could help them understand the phone and radio setup. Tamsin walked them to the side cabinet and pointed out the cut padlock. She explained what the cabinet powered and how the backup console could patch calls. The sergeant asked if a person inside could spoof the station number on outgoing calls. Tamsin said it was possible, but it would require access to the line interface. She opened her notebook and showed the message, written exactly as she heard it. The sergeant read it twice, then asked why someone would say not to call the sheriff. Tamsin said the voice sounded trained, like a script, not like panic or a prank. Dispatch came over the radio and said they had pulled archived calls from the station. According to dispatch logs, the station phone had called 911 twice that morning. Both calls were open line with faint clicking noises and no spoken words. The calls came from the station number and the location pinged correctly on their system. It meant someone used the station line, or someone made it look that way. A ranger supervisor arrived next, a woman named Marlo Penn, 41, district manager. She greeted the deputies with tight shoulders, then asked Tamsin to repeat everything. Tamsin did, and Marlo listened like she had heard pieces of it before. Marlo asked for the recorder back, and she promised it would be logged as evidence. Marlo also said 2 rangers were supposed to be on duty for training, but nobody checked in. She did not give names, and she kept details vague, like she was protecting staff. The deputies asked if there were any internal investigations, and she said, not officially. Then she said there were rumors, and rumors were why she drove out so fast. Inside the building, the deputies found a desk phone off the hook on the floor. They found the backup radio console open and a jumper wire tied into the patch port. Tamsin recognized the setup because it could route a radio transmission into the phone line. It could also route a phone audio feed into the radio if someone knew the settings. That detail changed the whole feeling of the day because it meant the warning call mattered. It also meant the clicking sound might be a relay toggling the patch on and off. Tamsin told Marlo that, and Marlo looked at the cabinet like it was a trap. Marlo asked if someone could broadcast using the station number as cover, and Tamsin nodded. By early afternoon, the search widened to the nearby trails and the storage shed behind the station. A K-9 team arrived and worked the porch, the hallway, and the back lot. Witness statements later said the dog alerted near a locked closet in the rear office. The closet was open when they forced it, and it held only a mop bucket and a clean shelf. But the wall behind the shelf sounded hollow, and a deputy noticed new screws in the trim. They removed the trim and found a narrow access panel hidden like a cheap stage trick. Behind it was a crawl space with a metal file box pushed deep into the dark. The box held cassette tapes, dispatch printouts, and a single blue folder with no label. Tamsin stood outside while they brought it out, and she watched faces tighten again. The tapes were old, and several were marked with months from 2016. A deputy said the folder contained copies of incident reports that were never filed properly. Some pages looked like drafts, with missing signatures and handwritten notes in the margins. One note said, "Do not send to county. Handle internally until winter." Marlowe took one look and asked for a formal chain of custody, and the sergeant agreed. She said the folder was supposed to be locked in the district safe, not in a wall. She also said the station had been used for unofficial debriefs after certain rescues. According to her, some calls were sensitive, and she regretted how that culture formed. That was when the twist started to take shape, not as a movie shock, but as a pattern. The missing Rangers were not missing in the wilderness. They were missing from the schedule. Their names were not on the public roster that week, and the training sign was a lie. The station had been used as a private listening post where recordings could be reviewed. Tamsin asked why anyone would hide that, and Marlowe gave a careful answer. She said there had been a whistleblower complaint months earlier, and people got scared. If the county took control of the station comms, certain mistakes would become permanent record. So someone tried to control the record, and controlling the record meant controlling the phones. The warning call to Tamsin now made a different kind of sense, and it was worse. Someone wanted the blue folder protected, but also wanted the patch setup discovered safely. They did not trust the sheriff, or they did not trust certain deputies, or both. So they called the one person who understood radios and who was not part of either side. Dispatch later confirmed something else from their archives, and it was the key detail. During the open line 911 calls, a faint voice was barely audible under the clicking. It sounded like a person trying to speak while someone else held a hand over their mouth. The words were not clear, but one phrase appeared in multiple transcript attempts. "Not the safe. Not the safe." Marlowe heard that and went pale, because the district safe had been opened that morning. The safe was located at a different office, miles away, and only two people had access. One was Marlowe, and the other was a senior ranger who had called in sick. Marlowe said she never opened it, and she offered her keys to the sergeant without hesitation. A search warrant followed, and what investigators reportedly found was not dramatic, just damning. The safe held empty folders where the blue folder should have been. A log showed it was accessed the previous night, after hours, with a code entry recorded. The code was used correctly, which meant the person knew it, or forced someone to type it. The senior ranger returned to work days later with a lawyer, and he said nothing useful. No charges were publicly announced connected to that specific day, at least not at the time. But internal discipline followed, and several staff were reassigned quietly over the next months. Marlowe kept her job, but she was moved to a role with less direct control. For Tamsin, the last piece came from her own recorder, which she finally got back. She listened to the first warning call again, and she noticed a soft second voice. It was so low that it sounded like air on the line, unless she wore good headphones. The second voice said one word, right after, "Bring the radio keys." It said, "Please." That was the part that bothered her most, because it sounded human and scared. It did not sound like a plot. It sounded like a person trapped in a bad decision. Tamsin gave the clip to the detective assigned to the case, and it went into evidence. After that, she was told not to discuss it, and she kept that promise. Years later, the station reopened with new locks, new policies, and a new phone system. The poster at dispatch stayed up because it did not blame anyone by name. It simply said, "Never ignore calls from a ranger station, because sometimes the call is not a request. Sometimes it is the only safe way someone can say that something is terribly wrong." The stories. Locals warned about this abandoned cabin for years. The cabin sat back in the pines, and locals kept warning newcomers to stay away from it. Those warnings sounded like small-town drama, until a maintenance worker found fresh boot prints in the dust. Kellen Brody was 36 and worked for the county parks department as a trails and facilities technician. On a cool weekday in early fall, he planned to swap a rotted signpost near a service road. The task was simple: drive out, set the post, snap a photo for records, then head back. He had done the same loop dozens of times, and he expected a quiet morning again. The service road cut through dense trees, and the radio lost signal not far from the highway. Kellen parked near a locked gate, then carried tools and a new sign down the old spur. Half a mile in, the trees opened around a clearing that should have been empty and flat. Instead, a cabin sat there, weathered boards and a sagging roof like it had been dropped from another decade. The cabin was not on his route sheet, and it was not in the park asset list either. Kellen had heard of it because people complained about trespassers and late-night fires near the clearing. A clerk at the front desk had once rolled her eyes and called it the cabin story again. Kellen never cared, because his job was signs, gates, and broken benches, not local legends. He set the new signpost first, then took a quick photo with his work phone for the file. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw something that pulled him off his schedule. A line of boot prints crossed the clearing, dark and crisp in pale dirt, heading straight to the front steps. The prints looked fresh, and the last rain had been 2 days earlier. Kellen told himself it could be hikers, but the cabin sat outside any marked trail network. He walked closer, scanning for trash, smoke, or anything that could start a brush fire. At the base of the steps, he noticed a second set of prints that ended and did not return. The ground was soft enough to hold detail, yet there was no matching path back to the tree line. The front door hung slightly open, and the gap looked too clean for a place that abandoned. Kellen stopped on the bottom step, then called out with the polite voice of a worker in public space. He said, "County maintenance, anybody in there?" No one answered, and the cabin gave back only a dull creak from settling wood. He should have backed out and called a ranger, yet the missing return prints felt wrong. Kellen stepped onto the porch, and the boards complained under his weight. Near the threshold, he saw a smear on the doorframe, like a hand brushed it while entering. The smear was dark, but it could have been mud, and he could not tell from the angle. Kellen pushed the door wider with his glove, then leaned inside without fully crossing the threshold. The air smelled old, like damp paper and stale smoke, but it was not the sharp stink of a new fire. Light slipped through cracks in the boards, and dust floated in thin lines across the room. On the floor, a scatter of dry leaves formed a rough arrow pointing toward the back wall. His eyes adjusted, and he saw why locals might warn people away even without a ghost story. A narrow trapdoor sat near the hearth, and its edges were scraped clean, as if opened often. Next to it was a coil of nylon rope, pale and newer than anything else in the cabin. Kellen felt a cold pinch in his stomach, because rope did not belong in a forgotten structure. He backed out, set his tools down, and pulled his phone from his vest pocket. The service bar was still empty, but he could record what he saw for the supervisor later. He took photos of the prints, the rope, and the trapdoor, keeping each frame steady and clear. Then he tried calling again, and the call failed before it could ring. Kellen did not want to go under the cabin alone, and he knew that was a hard rule. Still, he could not stop thinking about the second set of prints that ended at the steps. He decided to do one more thing that stayed on the safe side of his job. He would check around the outside for a second exit, then leave and drive for signal. He walked the cabin perimeter, watching his footing on loose stones and roots. Behind the structure, a shallow trench ran along the foundation, filled with needles and old cans. Halfway down the back wall, the trench deepened, and something metal glinted under dirt. Kellen crouched, brushed aside debris, and found a small square vent with a modern latch. The vent was nearly hidden, and it looked recently cleaned, which made it stand out. He did not open it, but he photographed it, then marked the spot in his phone notes. He typed short lines, cabin clearing, fresh prints, rope by trapdoor, vent with latch. He added the time, because details mattered when someone later asked what he had seen. By the time he returned to the gate, the quiet felt heavier than it should. Kellen loaded his tools, started the truck, and drove until his phone picked up a weak bar. He called his supervisor, then the regional ranger office, and he left a careful message. He said there were signs of activity at an abandoned cabin, and he was not going back alone. An hour later, a ranger named Sloan Maris met him at the gate with a second vehicle. Sloane was in her 40s, practical, and tired in the way of people who cover too much territory. She listened without interrupting, then asked for the photos and Kellen's exact walking route. Kellen handed over the phone, and she studied the prints and rope with a tight jaw. Sloane said the cabin was outside the official park map, but it still sat on public land. She also said locals called it the Long Cedar Place, and complaints came in every few months. Most reports were bonfires, dumped furniture, and teens daring each other to stay overnight. She did not mention ghosts, and her tone made it clear she did not want that part. They walked back together, and Kellen felt better with another set of footsteps beside his own. At the clearing, Sloane took her own photos, then measured the prints with a small ruler card. She pointed out that the deep heel marks suggested someone carrying weight going in. Then she paused at the steps, and she made a quiet sound, like a breath caught. There were two sets of prints now, and one set overlapped Kellen's earlier path. The newer set was lighter, and it came from the opposite edge of the clearing. It went to the porch, then turned and vanished near the front door, just like the other set. Sloane stared at the ground, then looked up at the trees as if expecting movement. She told Kellen to stay back, and she drew her radio even though the signal was poor. She tried the channel anyway, then switched to a second frequency and got only static. Kellen watched her shoulders tense, and he knew she was thinking about someone still inside. She stepped onto the porch, called out, and got the same silence Kellen had heard. Sloane did not go straight to the trap door, and that choice surprised Kellen. Instead, she moved to the side wall, then crouched near a warped window frame. She slid a small camera wand through a gap, and her face tightened as she watched the screen. Kellen could not see the display, but he saw her swallow, then pull the camera back slowly. She said there was a second door inside, not an exterior door, but a door that should not exist. She said it looked like it led into the wall, and the edges looked recently painted. Kellen blinked, because paint in that cabin would be like a bright flag in a swamp. Sloane told him to keep his distance, then she stepped into the cabin at last. Kellen stayed on the porch, angled so he could see the doorway and still watch the clearing. Inside, Sloane moved with careful steps, and the cabin groaned under her boots. He heard her say, "Ranger office. Identify yourself if you're here." Then he heard a faint click, like a latch turning, followed by a low drag across wood. Sloane backed out fast, and her expression had changed from caution to certainty. She said, "Someone is in there, and they have a way out you don't see." She told Kellen to return to the gate and wait, but he did not want to leave her alone. Sloane considered him for a moment, then told him to watch the tree line and stay silent. They held their positions for several minutes, and the only sound was wind through needles. Kellen's eyes kept returning to the boot prints that ended without a return path. He tried to picture how a person could step onto the porch and then disappear. Then he noticed something he had missed earlier, a thin line in the dirt beside the steps. The line was straight, like the track of something dragged, and it ran toward the side of the cabin. Kellen pointed it out, and Sloane nodded without taking her eyes off the doorway. She whispered, "That's a cover being pulled. Prosit." She moved along the porch edge, then dropped to one knee near the foundation. Near the porch corner, she found a plywood panel sunk into the ground like a loose hatch. Its top was dusted with dirt, but the corners were clean, like hands had lifted it often. Sloane used her knife to pry it, then held still, listening before she raised it fully. A cold draft rose from the opening, carrying the damp smell of soil and old concrete. Sloane kept her voice level and loud, and she called down into the dark. She said, "This is a ranger. Come up slowly and show your hands." For a few seconds, nothing happened, and Kellen felt his pulse thump in his ears. Then a voice answered, shaky and young, "Please, don't let him come back." A teenage boy climbed out, maybe 16, thin, covered in dust, and shaking hard. He looked at Kellen like he was trying to decide if he was real. Sloane guided him away from the hatch, then asked where the other person was. The boy swallowed, then said, "He's inside, and he locks the wall door." Sloane moved fast after that, and she told Kellen to stay with the boy. Kellen sat the kid on a rock and gave him water from his bottle. The boy held it with both hands, and his fingers would not stop trembling. He said his name was Rafi, and he had been working odd jobs with a man from a nearby town. Rafi said the man promised cash for hauling scrap out of the cabin and cleaning the clearing. Rafi also said the man called it a storage place and he acted like he owned it. When Rafi asked why the cabin was not on any map, the man told him not to worry. Then, the first time Rafi saw the trapdoor, he realized it was not just a cabin. Rafi said there was a basement room under the cabin with shelves and sealed plastic tubs. He said there were old tools, canned food, and stacks of papers wrapped in trash bags. He also said there were cameras, not new ones, but working ones with a small monitor. The man watched that monitor, and he told Rafi the cabin was safer than anywhere else. Kellen asked, "Safer from what?" Rafi looked toward the cabin, then lowered his voice like the trees could listen, he said. He said people used to come here to hide, and they never left clean. He added that locals warned about it, because strangers always seemed to vanish around it. Kellen did not want to push a frightened kid, but the details sounded too organized for trespassing. He asked how Rafi got out, and Rafi pointed to the hatch under the porch. He said the man showed it once, bragging about how nobody could follow footprints. He said there was a tunnel that ran into the hillside, then split behind a false wall inside. While they talked, Sloane returned, breathing hard, and she looked like she had seen enough. She said the cabin was rigged with simple alarms, fishing line, and bells in the dust. She said the wall door led to a narrow corridor, and it was built with newer lumber. The corridor ended at the vent Kellen found, and it opened into a shallow ravine under brush. Sloane said the man was gone, and the only sign was a fresh scrape in the corridor dust. She called for backup again, and this time the radio caught a weak signal. She gave coordinates in plain language and asked for deputies and a medic for the kid. Then she told Kellen they needed to document everything before weather or animals erased it. They did it step by step, slow enough to be boring, because boring kept mistakes away. Sloane recorded a short video on her body camera, narrating each feature they found. Kellen took still photos with timestamps, then saved copies to a separate work folder. They photographed the rope, the trapdoor, the false wall seam, and the hidden hatch track. Sloane asked Rafi to describe the basement, and she wrote it down word for word. She asked about the papers, the tubs, and the cameras, and whether any names appeared. Rafi said the papers had dates, mostly older, like 1980-something and 2002. He said there were maps with circles and receipts from hardware stores and burner phones without service. He also said he saw a stack of cassette tapes in a milk crate, all labeled with weekdays. Sloane took that seriously, because tapes meant recordings, and recordings meant evidence. She and Kellen entered together, and they kept their hands visible on camera the whole time. In the basement, they found the shelves Rafi described, and the monitor that still had a faint glow. The tubs were real, and the tapes were real, and the labels were written in careful block letters. They did not play the tapes there because they had to preserve the chain of custody. Still, Sloane photographed each label, and Kellen read them quietly as if they were fragile. Monday check-in, Tuesday check-in, Wednesday check-in, and so on, over and over. At the bottom of the crate was a single tape labeled Visitors with no date at all. There was also a binder, thick, with plastic sleeves holding printed pages. Kellen saw a page that looked like a call log, with times and short notes beside numbers. He saw phrases like gate open, truck passed, and lights in clearing, written without emotion. Sloane flipped to another page and found a list of names, but none were full names. They were nicknames like Skiff, Halo, and Brick, and each had a dollar amount beside it. Sloane said, "This is not a dare cabin." Kellen nodded, and he felt his mouth go dry as he looked at the tidy shelves. It felt like someone had been running a business, and the cabin was just the front. Rafi kept saying the man watched people, and those tapes made that claim feel more believable. When deputies finally arrived, the clearing filled with engines and voices, and the spell broke. Sloane briefed them, then handed over the tape crate and binder with careful signatures. A medic checked Rafi, and he did not have visible injuries beyond scrapes and dehydration. Rafi said he had been down there only overnight, but he thought it had been longer. Over the next week, Kellen got pulled into interviews and paperwork he never expected. He met with a county investigator who asked him to walk through every minute of his morning. He provided his photos, his notes, and his call attempts, and he signed statements twice. He also learned from Sloane that the cabin had a real history, and it was uglier than rumors. Reportedly, the cabin had belonged to a private hunting club decades earlier, then burned partially and was rebuilt. After that, it became a meeting spot for all kinds of people who wanted to avoid attention. An archive clerk found old complaints about shouting and headlights in the clearing dating back to 1996. There were also missing property reports, like tools and bikes, that clustered around the same months. The warnings locals gave were not supernatural, and they were not just about trespassing. They were about a place that made it easy to disappear for a night, or a week, or longer. The tunnel explained the missing footprints, and the false wall explained the vanishing act. What surprised everyone was how long the setup had lasted, and how calmly it was maintained. The twist came from the tapes, once they were reviewed in a controlled lab. According to the investigator, several tapes captured short conversations, not confessions, but transactions and threats. One tape, the visitor's tape, included a voice that matched a former county contractor. That contractor had worked on culverts and drainage years earlier, and he had access to equipment and permits. The case tightened when purchase records matched lumber and vent hardware to a job billed as erosion control. The hidden vent was installed under cover of that work, and it blended into real maintenance. It meant the cabin was not just an accident of history, it was updated with official-looking paperwork. That was why it stayed off radar, because it hid behind normal processes and boring invoices. Kellen kept thinking about the moment he saw the prints that did not return. He realized the warning was never about the cabin itself, it was about the system around it. A place can be rotten and still look ordinary, especially when someone keeps it swept. When he drove past the gate later, the clearing was empty again, and the cabin was finally boarded up. Rafi was placed with relatives, and his statement became a small hinge in a bigger investigation. Sloane kept her tone steady whenever Kellen asked how it ended, because cases like that rarely end clean. She did say the main suspect vanished before arrest, and that alone kept the locals uneasy. Still, the tunnel was sealed, the tapes were secured, and the cabin stopped being useful. Months later, Kellen replaced the signpost again, because weather never stops doing its own work. He stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to the ordinary forest sounds. The cabin looked smaller with boards across every opening, like a mouth forced shut. Kellen understood why people warned others for years, even if they never knew the exact reason. He walked back to his truck, and he did not glance over his shoulder this time. Some places earn their reputation the slow way, through patterns people notice without proof. This one earned it through careful planning and through a hidden door that erased footsteps. And for once, the warning finally matched the truth, even if the truth arrived late. The stories. The most troubling cases of missing hikers. The case file was thin, but the silence around it was heavy. It started with a trail register page that ended mid-sentence, and nobody could explain why. In early October of 2017, Lyle Maris was 38 and worked as a county records clerk. He handled archived reports, public requests, and the boring paperwork that kept a small sheriff office afloat. That morning, he planned to scan old search logs, then get home before the first hard rain. He did not plan to reopen a missing hikers case that everyone acted allergic to. The request came in a plain envelope with no return address and a sticky note inside. The note asked for copies of 3 files, all tied to the same state forest trail system. It also included a date range, and it ended with one sentence that felt like a dare. Do not call it an accident until you read the audio. Lyle was used to weird mail, but this one carried details only staff should know. He pulled the files from the back room, and he noticed something immediately. Each folder had the same handwriting on the spine and a strip of tape over the label. The tape looked old, and it had been trimmed clean, like someone wanted it to look official. The first file was from late summer of 2011, involving 2-day hikers. They parked at a trailhead near a reservoir and never returned before dark. Search teams found their car, their lunches, and their jackets folded on the back seat. The report said there was no sign of foul play, but it also said the keys were missing. The second file was from 2013, involving a couple and their dog. Witness statements placed them on the main trail at noon, heading toward a fire lookout. The dog was found the next day, wet and shaking, with a leash still attached. The couple was never found, and the report ended with a single line about bad weather. The third file was newer, from late spring of 2015 involving a lone hiker. Her friends said she was careful, and she always texted when she hit a landmark. Her phone last pinged near an old service road, then went quiet like it had been turned off. Searchers found her pack under a downed log, and it was neatly zipped and dry. Lyle did not like the pattern, but he could not say why yet. None of the cases were famous, and they were not tied to any public scandal. Still, someone had blocked the labels, and someone wanted the audio. Lyle checked the file inventory, and he saw a line item called Field Recording Station Copy. The sheriff office kept old audio in a small evidence room, but access was logged. Lyle asked the evidence tech, a man named Bracken Rudd, 46, civilian specialist. Bracken said the tapes were real, and he looked annoyed that Lyle even knew about them. He said the recordings came from a volunteer search leader who carried a handheld radio. Then he added that the recordings were mostly wind and there was nothing helpful. Lyle asked if he could listen anyway, because the request specifically mentioned audio. Bracken shrugged, then signed the checkout in a slow and careful way. He handed Lyle a small digital file player with a single folder loaded onto it. The folder name matched the trail system, and it held 3 audio clips. Lyle listened at his desk with cheap headphones, trying to keep his face neutral. The first clip started with radio chatter, then a pause, then a clipped female voice. Copy, Team 2 is at marker 7. Hearing something ahead? Might be hikers. Then there was a low sound under the static, like a steady tone that wavered. The voice returned, quieter now, and it did not sound like she was joking. Someone is whistling. It is close, but I do not see anybody on the trail. A second voice replied from base, asking if she meant a bird call. She said no, and then the clip ended with a sharp click. The second clip was longer and worse because it included more than one witness. A man spoke first, and he was breathing hard, like he had been running uphill. Base, this is Ridge Team. We found the dog, no people. The dog keeps pulling north. Base asked for location, and he gave a marker number and a creek crossing. Then the same low tone appeared again, faint but constant, riding under every word. The man said, "Do you hear that? Tell me you hear that." Base replied, "Negative. Copy your traffic. What is the sound on your end?" The man did not answer right away, and when he did, his voice had changed. "It is like a phone ringing, but not right. It is coming from the trees." Another voice joined in, a woman, and she sounded angry and scared at the same time. "Stop calling back. Whoever is doing it is moving. It keeps pacing us." Base told them to regroup, and the clip ended with heavy footsteps and a curse. The third clip was from the 2015 case, and it started calm. A volunteer said they had found the pack, and it looked staged, not dropped. Base asked what he meant, and he said the pack was clean and centered on the log. Then the tone appeared again, louder this time, and it pulsed like a slow alarm. The volunteer lowered his voice, like he was afraid the radio itself could betray him. "Someone is answering our calls, not on the repeater. It is local, like line of sight." Base asked who was answering, and the volunteer said he could not see them. He added one detail that made Lyle pause with his hand on the volume knob. "It is using her voice. It is using her exact voice." Base demanded he repeat, and the volunteer said, "It is her. It is the missing hiker." Then a sound cut through the tone, a short laugh, and it was too clean to be wind. The clip ended right after, as if somebody had hit stop on purpose. Lyle sat back, and he felt his throat tighten in a way he could not explain. He had heard enough dispatch audio to know when something was off. Voices on radios can warp, but this sounded like a deliberate imitation. He checked the player, and he saw a note field attached to the third clip. The note was time-stamped, and it said, "Do not release, causes copycat behavior." Lyle stared at it, because it did not sound like normal evidence language. He opened the case file again and looked for the author of the note. It was signed by a lieutenant who retired years ago, and who had a reputation for control. Lyle did what records clerks do when they get nervous. He went to the paper trail, because paper does not care about feelings. He pulled dispatch logs for the search days, and he compared timestamps to the clips. The audio did not match the official logs, not perfectly, not even close. In the 2011 case, the log showed no mention of whistling. In the 2013 case, the log listed routine updates and nothing unusual. In the 2015 case, The log said the pack was found, then it jumped ahead. The gap was 47 minutes, and the log had a generic entry that did not explain it. Lyle printed the pages, then walked them to the deputy captain, who oversaw records. The captain was named Odessa Train, 52, patrol supervisor, and she had seen everything. She read the pages, then listened to the clips with a stiff jaw. When she finished, she did not say it was fake, and she did not say it was real. She asked where Lyle got the player, and he said from evidence checkout. She asked who else had access, and he named Bracken and a few supervisors. Odessa told Lyle to stop working the case, but her tone was not angry. It sounded like caution, the kind that comes from knowing a door should stay shut. Lyle nodded, but he could not let it go after hearing the imitation claim. He asked Odessa one direct question, and he kept his voice low. Did anybody ever find the source of that tone? Odessa held his eyes for a moment, then said, "They said it was interference." That answer was not satisfying, because interference does not track across years like a fingerprint. Lyle went home with the envelope still on his desk, and he barely tasted dinner. That night, he searched old newspaper microfilm, because the internet did not hold local history. He found brief articles about each case, but they all shared one strange detail. Each article mentioned a ranger station hotline set up for tips. The number was printed, then removed in later editions, like it had been a mistake. Lyle checked the old phone list, and he found the number was still active. It rang to a recorded message that said the station was closed for the season. The next morning, Lyle arrived early and asked Bracken about the hotline number. Bracken stiffened, then said that number belonged to a radio patch line, not a public phone. He said it was used during searches to bridge handheld radios to dispatch when coverage failed. Lyle asked why a patch line had a public recording, and Bracken said he did not know. Lyle did not press harder, because Bracken looked like he wanted to end the conversation. Instead, Lyle called the number from his desk phone, then held his recorder near the speaker. The message played, and it sounded normal at first, like any board announcement voice. Then, under the words, the low tone crept in. Faint, but present, like a shadow. Lyle stopped the recording, then replayed it, and the tone was still there. He called again, and the tone shifted slightly, like it was responding to the call. He did it a third time, and he heard a tiny click between phrases. It was the same click that ended the first clip from 2011. Lyle brought his recording to Odessa, and this time she did not tell him to stop. She told him to sit down, then she locked her office door. Odessa said there was something older than the three cases, and it was why people avoided them. She said a decade earlier, a volunteer had abused the patch system to prank search teams. According to witness statements, the volunteer used the patch to mimic lost hikers on radio. He did it to keep morale up and to test response time, and it went too far. A young deputy confronted him in the woods, and a fight happened near a ravine. The volunteer fell, and the deputy claimed it was an accident, and the file vanished. Odessa said the patch line was never fully decommissioned after that. It stayed, because it was useful, and because nobody wanted to admit the history. She said some supervisors treated it like a ghost story, and others treated it like leverage. When new hikers went missing, the old prank story came back, like a stain that would not wash. Lyle asked if that explained the imitation voice in the 2015 audio. Odessa said it could, but only if somebody still had access and still wanted control. She said the most troubling part was not the tone or the voice. It was the way the official logs had been cleaned, as if someone edited reality after the fact. Together, they pulled the maintenance records for the patch system. They found work orders signed by the retired lieutenant years after his supposed retirement. The signatures matched his style, and the dates aligned with the 3 search periods. It looked like he kept his hands on the system, even after he stopped wearing a badge. Odessa contacted the county IT contractor who handled old radio gear, a man named Kellen Swope, 44. Kellen agreed to inspect the patch cabinet at the ranger station site. He found a hidden add-on board that allowed call forwarding and voice playback. It was not standard equipment, and it was installed cleanly, like someone knew what they were doing. Kellen also found a small memory card taped inside the cabinet. The card contained voice samples labeled with dates and trail marker numbers. Some samples were harmless, like volunteers calling in their positions. Others were short clips of hikers on the day they vanished, taken from tip line voicemails. That was the payoff nobody wanted, because it tied the missing hikers to a human choice. Someone had been collecting their voices, then using those voices during searches. It did not prove the same person caused the disappearances, and Odessa was careful about that. But it proved someone exploited the chaos, and someone wanted the searches to move a certain way. In one file, a witness had reported hearing a phone ring in the trees near a creek. The search team went toward the sound, and they left the main trail for almost an hour. In another file, a volunteer heard a voice call her name from a ravine, and she went alone. She later told investigators she felt embarrassed because it sounded like her missing friend. Those moments were the cracks, and someone had been pushing on them. Odessa opened an internal investigation, and the county prosecutor reviewed what they could prove. The retired lieutenant was questioned, and he denied installing anything. He said the card was planted, and he said the clips were taken out of context. No public arrest followed, at least not in a way the town could point to and feel satisfied. But the ranger station patch line was shut down, and the hotline number went dead. New policy required sealed logs and outside audits during every future search. The 3 cases remained unsolved because the woods do not offer clean answers. Still, the way the searches unfolded now had a more believable explanation. Lyle kept thinking about the envelope and the sticky note, and who sent it. He asked Odessa if she knew, and she said she had a strong guess. She believed it was a former volunteer, someone who felt guilty and wanted the truth on record. That person did not want credit and did not want to be seen as a snitch in a small county. Weeks later, Lyle returned the files to storage and retaped the labels properly. He did not do it to hide them, he did it to mark them as normal evidence again. Some cases become legends, and legends make people careless in the wrong ways. These cases were troubling because they showed how easy it is to steer a search. When hikers vanish, the first enemy is time, and the second enemy is confusion. A single false sound can move trained people off a trail and into wasted hours. The woods can be cruel on their own, but people can make them worse. That is why the most troubling cases are not always about what happened out there. The stories. The bus driver who turned back years later. The route ended early, and the radio kept talking after the bus went silent. Years later, the same driver returned to the last stop and found out why. Dorian Klein was 44 and worked weekday mornings for a regional transit contractor. He drove a long commuter loop through timber towns, then back toward the highway. That Tuesday started like any other, with coffee in a paper cup and a schedule clipped to plastic. He planned to finish the loop, fuel up, and be home before dark. The town was small enough that Dorian recognized most riders by their shoes. A nurse with squeaky clogs, a mill worker with orange earplugs, a student with a sketchbook. They nodded at him like he was part of the scenery, which he liked. The bus was old, but it ran, and the heater worked. His biggest worry that morning was a fog bank near the river bridge. Dispatch called him once to confirm a detour around a washout, and he read it back cleanly. The road was narrow, with tall firs and no shoulder in spots. Dorian kept both hands steady and watched for deer, then for loose gravel. The bus climbed into higher ground where cell service dropped to nothing. He passed the last convenience store and felt that familiar quiet settle in. At 11:30, he reached the turnaround near an abandoned rest area. It was a patch of cracked asphalt, a closed bathroom building, and a picnic table that leaned sideways. The map called it a stop, but nobody used it anymore. It existed for the timetable, not for people. Dorian opened the doors out of habit, waited 10 seconds, then closed them again. That was when he saw the backpack in the aisle, sitting upright like someone had placed it carefully. It was a plain gray bag, not one he recognized from earlier. Dorian checked the mirrors, then looked at his passenger count sheet. The bus was empty. And it had been empty since the last drop-off by the mill gate. He remembered the last rider getting off, because the kid thanked him twice. Dorian walked back and touched the backpack with 2 fingers, like it might be hot. It was heavier than it looked, and something inside clinked softly. He set it on the front seat, then keyed the radio. He told dispatch there was a lost bag and asked if anyone had called in. Dispatch said nobody had reported anything yet and told him to bring it to the depot. He should have just turned around, but he noticed a smell when he lifted it again. It was sharp, like pool cleaner, mixed with something sweet and wrong. Dorian hesitated, then unzipped the top a few inches. Inside was a plastic bottle with a rag stuffed into the neck and a second bottle taped to it. There were also matchbooks and a folded paper with a hand-drawn diagram. Dorian zipped it shut fast, and his throat went dry. He backed away and stared at the bag like it could move. He keyed the radio again, and this time his voice came out thin. He told dispatch the bag looked dangerous, and he needed instructions right now. Dispatch asked what kind of dangerous, and Dorian said he did not want to describe it over an open channel. Dispatch told him to pull off the route and wait for law enforcement. Dorian said there was nowhere safe to pull off, and the rest area was closed. Dispatch told him to stay put, doors locked, and keep the radio open. Dorian did what he was told and tried not to look at the backpack. He turned off the engine to save fuel, then turned it back on because the quiet made his ears ring. Fog rolled between the trees, and the rest area sign creaked in the wind. He watched the road in the mirror, expecting headlights, but the road stayed empty. After 10 minutes, the radio crackled, then went dead for a moment. Dorian thought he heard someone breathing on the line, then a click, then silence again. He pressed the talk button and asked dispatch to confirm. Dispatch answered, but the reply sounded delayed, like the words were coming through water. A car appeared from the trees, not on the road, but in the gravel lot behind the closed bathrooms. Dorian had not heard it arrive. It was an older sedan with no front plate, and its paint looked dull, almost dusty. A person stepped out, hood up, hands in pockets, walking slow toward the bus. Dorian locked the doors again, even though they were already locked. He picked up the radio mic and told dispatch someone was approaching the bus from the rear lot. Dispatch told him to stay inside and asked for a description. Dorian said the person looked average height, bulky jacket, face not visible. The person kept coming, and Dorian felt his heartbeat in his fingertips. The person reached the side of the bus and knocked once, then twice, polite and steady. Dorian did not answer, and the person knocked again, then pressed their forehead to the glass. Dorian could not see eyes under the hood, only a shadow and the outline of a nose. The person pointed at the backpack on the front seat, then made a slow, twisting motion with their hand, like turning a key. Dorian shook his head hard, then mouthed no, and backed away. The person tapped the glass and pointed again, more urgent. Then they stepped away, walked to the front of the bus, and crouched near the wheel well. Dorian lost sight of them, and panic spread through him like heat. He told dispatch the person was at the front of the bus, and then the engine coughed. The dashboard lights flickered, and the bus shuddered as if someone had tugged a cable. Dorian reached for the door switch to force the doors open, thinking he might run, but the switch did nothing. He tried the emergency lever, and it stuck halfway. The bus horn blared once without his hands on it, loud and sudden, then went quiet. Dorian heard a metallic scrape under the floor, near the front axle. He grabbed the fire extinguisher and held it like a bat. He kept his eyes on the windshield, waiting for the hooded person to reappear. Instead, he saw the sedan roll slowly into view, now on the road, moving away. The hooded person was behind the wheel, and the car picked up speed as it disappeared into fog. The bus sat there, trembling, and Dorian realized the backpack was still on the seat. He also realized dispatch had stopped talking. He pressed the mic and shouted, asking if anyone was on the line. The radio gave only a hiss, then a broken fragment of speech, like a recording clipped mid-sentence. Dorian sat down hard and tried to breathe through his nose. He stared at the backpack and wondered if the person had tried to disable the bus to get it back. A state trooper arrived almost 40 minutes later, lights flashing through the fog. Another unit came behind, and then a county deputy. Dorian watched them approach with caution, hands visible, weapons low, but ready. They ordered him out, moved him away from the bus, and asked him to sit on the asphalt with his hands on his knees. His legs shook so badly he could not stand straight. The trooper entered the bus with gloves on and carried the backpack out like it was alive. The deputy asked Dorian to repeat everything, and Dorian did, word by word. He told them about the smell, the diagram, the hooded person, the strange radio delay. He told them he had not touched anything after the first unzip. The deputy nodded, but his eyes stayed flat. They shut the road down for hours and brought in a specialist from another county. Dorian saw them place the backpack in a thick container and load it into a truck. They never told him exactly what it was, only that he did the right thing. The rest area stayed closed, and his route was canceled for the day. Dorian went home and sat in his kitchen until dawn, still hearing the knock in his head. He returned to work 2 days later, then quit before the month ended. He told people he could not handle the mountain roads anymore, and that was mostly true. He found a job as a freight dispatcher, where the worst thing that happened was a missed pickup. The bus company replaced him, and the route kept running, but Dorian avoided that highway like it was cursed. Time did what it always does, and the story turned into a rumor. Some people claimed it was a bomb. Others said it was drugs. Others said it was nothing. Dorian never corrected anyone because he did not have proof, only memory. He tried to file an information request once, but the response came back thin and redacted. After a while, he stopped trying. In the summer of 2023, Dorian got a letter with the county seal on it. It was brief and careful, inviting him to speak with an investigator about the old incident. The name on the letter was not a detective name, but an analyst, someone who worked cold files and archived records. Dorian almost threw it away, but curiosity won. The meeting took place in a plain office behind the courthouse with bad carpet and fluorescent lights. The analyst was a woman in her 50s named Mrballen. She had wireframe glasses and a calm voice that never rose. She did not act like someone chasing headlines, more like someone cleaning up an old mess. Maris asked Dorian to tell the story again, and he did. She listened without interrupting, writing notes in neat block letters. When he finished, she nodded once and slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of dispatch logs, a grainy still frame from a bus camera, and a map printout with circles drawn in pen. Dorian looked at the still frame first, and his stomach tightened. It showed the hooded person by the glass, head tilted, finger pointing toward the front seat. The camera timestamp read 11:37, and the image was clearer than Dorian expected. The person wore gloves, and the hood shadowed the face, but the shape of the jacket was distinct. Dorian recognized the bulk at the shoulders, like thick padding. Maris tapped the dispatch logs with her finger and said the radio delay was real. The audio had been recorded at the dispatch center, and the waveform showed dropouts. The recording also contained an odd segment, a brief voice that was not dispatch. It sounded like a man, speaking low, saying, "Turn the key and come back." Dorian felt his skin prickle because that was the exact gesture the hooded person made. He asked Maris who said it, and she said they did not know. The channel was supposed to be secure, but on that stretch, it could be reached by a strong enough handheld. Maris said the voice might have been close to the bus, using the terrain to push signal. Maris then showed him the map and asked if he had ever looked behind the rest area bathrooms. Dorian said he saw the sedan back there and nothing else. Maris said deputies searched the area that day, but their search was limited by fog and time. She said a new search had been done recently, after a forestry crew found something odd during brush clearing. Dorian asked what they found, and Maris paused before answering. She said they found a shallow cache, wrapped in tarp, buried under old gravel. Inside were several items, including bus schedules, matchbooks, and a set of gloves with rubberized palms. There was also a small notebook with a hand-drawn diagram that matched Dorian's description. Dorian swallowed and asked why this was coming up now. Maris said the notebook included dates and route numbers that continued beyond the day Dorian stopped driving. It looked like planning for later attempts that never happened. Maris said the person might have been practicing or waiting for a better opportunity. The sudden stop may have forced them to abandon the cache. Dorian asked if they ever identified the person, and Maris said they had a lead, but it was incomplete. She said a traffic camera on the highway caught the sedan later that day, but the plate was unreadable. However, a repair shop invoice had surfaced years later, connected to a similar car with a cracked headlight. The customer used cash and a false name, but the shop kept a copy of a handwritten note. Maris slid another photocopy across the table. It was a short note, written in sloppy print, asking for a quick fix and a return pickup at the old rest area. At the bottom was a signature that looked like two initials, then a last name. Dorian stared at it and felt a strange jolt of recognition, like seeing a face in a crowd. He told Maris the last name matched the mill gate where he dropped off the last rider that morning. The mill had a security desk, and Dorian remembered the guard's name tag because it was unusual. The name on the note was the same. Dorian's mouth went dry as he said it out loud. Maris nodded, like she had been waiting for that connection. She said the old mill had kept shift rosters, and one guard with that last name had worked there briefly. The guard left after a complaint about erratic behavior and missing tools. The guard also lived near the bus route in a rural rental with a shed. Years later, the guard died in an accident, and the property was sold. Dorian asked if they searched the shed, and Maris said they did, after getting permission from the new owner. She said they found nothing dramatic, but they did find a box of old transit tokens and a handheld radio with a modified antenna. They also found a jacket with padded shoulders, and the fabric matched the camera still. Maris said it was not enough for a case, but it was enough to answer questions. Dorian sat back and tried to process it, because the fear had never had a shape before. He asked why the person wanted the backpack back so badly. Maris said the evidence suggested it was not meant to be used on the bus itself. It was meant to be carried off at a later stop, possibly handed to someone else. The rest area was a meeting point, not a target. Maris said the diagram showed fuel storage locations, not inside the bus, but near a maintenance yard. It looked like sabotage planning aimed at equipment, not people. That mattered, but it did not make Dorian feel better. Dorian said the person still tried to trap him, and Maris agreed. She said the person likely panicked when the bag was discovered early and tried to recover it at any cost. Dorian asked about the strange moment with the horn and the door switch. Maris said technicians inspected the bus afterward and found the battery cable had been pulled loose. She said it could have been vibration, but it was unlikely. The scrape Dorian heard matched the position where someone could reach under and yank it. The horn could have triggered as voltage dropped, like a dying gasp. Dorian's hands started shaking again, and he clasped them tightly. He asked why the person drove away instead of fighting harder. Maris said the arriving patrol units were seen by the sedan driver before they reached the rest area. A watcher could have been posted down the road, or the driver could have heard sirens echo. The safest choice was to flee and leave the cash for later. Dorian stared at the bus camera still again and noticed something he never saw before. The hooded person's glove had a tear at the thumb, and a strip of pale skin showed. Dorian remembered that the mill guard with the unusual name had a bandage on his thumb once, back when Dorian still drove that route. Dorian could not be sure it was the same person, but the memory hit like cold water. Maris asked Dorian why he came back to this now, after so many years. Dorian said he did not choose it, the letter did. Maris said he did choose it because he walked into the office. Dorian looked at her and gave a small, tired smile. He told Maris the truth, which was that the unfinished part had followed him for years. It was not the backpack, or the fog, or even the knock. It was the moment the radio seemed to breathe, like someone was already inside the line. He said it made him feel watched in a way he could not explain. Maris said sometimes the mind saves the sharpest details, because they matter. Before Dorian left, Maris asked if he wanted to see the rest area again. Dorian surprised himself by saying yes, but not alone. 2 days later, Maris and a deputy met him at the old turnout in clear weather. The bathrooms were still boarded, and weeds pushed through the asphalt cracks. The place looked smaller than it did in memory. They walked behind the building where the sedan had been, and the deputy pointed to a patch of disturbed gravel. Dorian saw the shallow pit where the cache had been, now filled in again. He looked at the trees and listened to the wind, waiting for a knock that did not come. In daylight, it felt like any abandoned place, lonely and ordinary. Maris showed him the exact spot where the bus had parked, marked by a faded paint line. She asked him to stand there and look at the road, and Dorian did. He imagined the hooded figure, the radio hiss, the dead channel. He imagined the moment he chose to unzip the bag and the moment he chose to zip it back up. Dorian realized that small choices were the whole story. If he had ignored the bag, it might have been carried off later. If he had opened it fully, something could have spilled or sparked. If he had opened the doors to speak with the hooded person, the person might have gotten inside. The route could have ended in a different kind of silence. The deputy told Dorian they were closing the old file as far as they could. They had a likely suspect, but no living person to charge, and no clear proof of an intended crime. The evidence would be preserved, and the maintenance yards had new security measures now. Dorian nodded, because that was as close to an ending as reality often gave. On the drive back, Dorian watched the trees slide past and felt his shoulders relax for the first time in years. The fear did not vanish, but it shrank into something he could carry without dropping everything else. He had come back, and the place did not swallow him. He had faced the last stop, and it stayed quiet. That night, Dorian slept with the window cracked, and the cold air felt clean. He still dreamed of the knock sometimes, but now the dream had edges. It was no longer a faceless force in fog, it was a person making desperate choices. Dorian did not forgive that person, but he finally understood the shape of it. The next morning, Dorian drove to work in his own car and merged onto the highway without flinching. He watched a city bus pull into a stop and open its doors, ordinary and loud. For a moment, he imagined the driver inside, doing the job, trusting the schedule, trusting the radio. Dorian hoped that driver never had to turn back years later, just to learn why.